Nowadays, every game or game franchise has become more open in terms of their world or just level design in general, or has become flat out open world games, which otherwise were kind of this linear open level design games to begin with. And I'm mainly talking about games such as Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, or even just any Ubisoft game in that matter. And I've talked about this in my previous videos, especially when talking about The Witcher 3 and the potential KOTOR remakes as well. But when it comes to open world games, just in general in the last half a decade, I don't have a problem with the open world game in general if the design choice is a warranted one, like when it comes to GTA or Red Dead Redemption or The Witcher 3. But to me, when talking about these open world games, or the genre even now of open world games, the why of the open world design is important to me, as in ways that does it support the narrative or aid the story or the narrative of the game? Is it part of the narrative of the whole game? As we have seen a few Sony exclusive games, I'm mainly thinking about Ghost of Tsushima, where the open world design is part of the narrative and the story. Same goes for Horizon Zero Dawn, or even one of my recent favorite games, Days Gone, which of course uses the open world design in a way where it's part of the story, but it doesn't really feel as open world or overwhelming as in other games. Or instead of aiding the story or supporting the game or the narrative, it can take away from it, as was kind of evident with the latest Assassin's Creed games or installments in the franchise. I'm mainly talking about Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Valhalla, as those games were even too big for themselves, and they wanted to fix a lot of those issues that players had with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where the map was just huge for the sake of being huge, not because it was full of content in general. And with Valhalla, they wanted to build a huge open world, but the story itself doesn't really warrant that, and it really suffered for it. But why genre of open world games have become so prominent that every single franchise has now become an open world game or has an open world entry? Because it sells well, to be perfectly honest. It's a really safe bet when it comes to minimizing the risk of these products, as of course video games in the last 10 years have become so expensive that they have to minimize risks wherever it's possible. And you can see it with the Assassin's Creed franchise. They went open world because the sales declined, and they attributed the lower amount of sales to the game design. And in order to maximize their profits, they thought that they had to go open world. But it was the detriment to the franchise as well. But think of it as like the genre of superhero movies. As of course making a superhero movie is basically going to be profitable like no matter what. In the past 10 years, there hasn't really been any movie which has flopped at the box office. Only the ones that were mismanaged from the start. But when you minimize the risk and remove a core element of the franchise, like in Assassin's Creed, where the story and the game was based in cities, they have moved into a huge open world. They have removed and neutered the parkour system of the game, which was the integral part of the whole experience of being an assassin. They have removed what made the franchise stand out or special in the first place. And it has cost the series its integrity, if you will. And of course, open worlds keep players engaged for longer because you have to spend more time with the game to beat the game. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better experience overall, as of course there are huge open world games which are meant to be open world. But when it comes to a huge world in general, you have to stretch out the story of the game to fit that open worldness or that huge playground that you're playing with. And as I mentioned in my Assassin's Creed Valhalla video, this made the story much more bloated and not as focused as you would have liked it to be, as if you even think about The Witcher 3, the story is warranted for that open world because the story is this huge epic narrative between good and evil finding your daughter. And it takes about like 50-60 hours to complete in general, but you don't feel like burned out. You feel like you have experienced a wonderful and wonderfully engaging story to begin with. But I feel like that the streamlined experiences are always more memorable to the players, as a lot of players don't finish these long games like The Witcher 3, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Valhalla, because they are too long. And when it comes to just streamlined experiences, I'm mainly talking about like Assassin's Creed 2 or Brotherhood in contrast to Odyssey or Valhalla, as I could basically beat Assassin's Creed Brotherhood or even just the Ezio trilogy instead of playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And that goes back even to the Mass Effect trilogy, as the Mass Effect games weren't like huge epics in terms of length, but they supported the narrative, and the narrative was always this 15-20 hour experience in and of itself, not this 50-60 hour game which you just have to play but not necessarily enjoy most, if not all, parts of it. And what is really interesting here is that when it came to Valhalla, narrative director Darby McDevitt has actually stated that when they were talking about and discussing ideas for the game, they originally had 3 locations or 3 cities for the game, that being London, Winchester, and Jorvik. And to me that sounded very Assassin's Creedy, of course, but as the project became bigger and bigger and the studio wanted them to create a huge open world, they had to take away what made that kind of core concept of the game, Assassin's Creed, and to develop it into this huge open world. But when it comes to these huge playgrounds, the space that is created there can be used as a storytelling tool. As when it comes to Death Stranding, when you're playing the game, you have this sense of smallness and loneliness when you traverse the huge open world, huge and beautiful open world that the game presents you with. But at the end of your journey, there is the joy of finally arriving at your destination, while you are realizing that the journey is the important part, or was the important part of your whole quest, not necessarily the destination. But when it comes to open world games, you have to talk about how you traverse the very environment. And I feel like that usually this is the boring part of the game, as the traversal mechanic is not necessarily a part of the story or the narrative or the experience of the whole game. They are kind of put in there as like, you have to get from A to B and we give you a tool to do that. But of course, some games flip that concept or that tool on its head. And my main examples would be Red Dead Redemption 2 or even Death Stranding, or even Days Gone, where in Days Gone you have the drifter bike, of course. And the whole point of this traversal in these games, or the tool of the traversal, would be to not make you fast travel in the games. As if you fast travel, it signals that the traversal system created by the game is not as enjoyable as just pressing a button. Fast travel is a great option, but it's not necessarily if the traversal system is engaging enough. And this is what you had with Days Gone, where you had, of course, the drifter bike. And while I played the game, I spent like 60 hours playing the game. I think I have only fast traveled once. And that's because the drifter bike feels so amazing to control, and there's actually a kind of economy between the fuel and how you press the throttle and how you actually use that amount of fuel when you are traversing the environment, and it's incredibly fun. And I never really expected a AAA game to do that, but I was pleasantly surprised when I learned how great the vehicle controls and how fun and engaging that whole traversal system was. And maybe another drawback of these worlds is that if you have a huge world, which is not visually interesting enough, I'm mainly referring to the Ubisoft games where there are map markers everywhere, instead of encouraging the player's curiosity to just explore things. This just gives you this way of hand-holding, and it takes away from that experience that I see a mountain like 5 kilometers from me and I would like to explore it, but the game doesn't necessarily allow you to do that, or that it just gives you a map marker that you should visit the location because there is something there and you're not going to visit other locations, which could be visually interesting, but they don't have anything there, so you are not encouraged to visit those locations. A game which kind of improved upon this map marker thing that I've mentioned before was Ghost of Tsushima, where instead of giving you the compass or just a minimap, the game actually used the guiding wind, which was a very natural way, instead of just giving you map markers overall. And I don't think that the game actually had a compass or a minimap. I certainly didn't use a compass for the game. I think it only had the guiding wind, which was really awesome. But when you make a huge world, there has to be a dynamism in the real economy instead of these copy-pasted objects and NPCs. As when I think about games in the open world genre like The Witcher 3. I immediately think about when I have experienced an interaction in the woods where the wolves were attacking the deer, or the deers, in order, of course, to gain some food. And it just made the whole world feel much more natural and much more organic in a way where if you have just copy-pasted objects, you are not as much invested in the game and immersed in the gaming experience as you would otherwise be when you have these really organic things happening in front of you. And this just segues onto my other point, is that the bigger a world gets, the less detail it usually entails, and therefore it feels less immersive or less real in general, and it can be a detriment, as when I play games, I don't necessarily play games to do X and Y tasks or missions to gain new levels and to have that new cool ability. I play games because I want to unwind and enjoy myself and immerse myself in another world, and this helps that a lot. But of course, that doesn't mean that, like everything I have mentioned previously, that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in open world games, because I am very much interested in the new and upcoming Ubisoft open world Star Wars game. And I'm very much interested on how they handle the long rumored KOTOR remakes, as I've talked about that in my previous video. But I'm cautious about these things, as in the last 5 years I've played a ton of open world games, and I feel like that I'm so burnt out and tired of them that I just rather crave these linear experiences like even the Mass Effect trilogy, and this is why I'm so excited to finally play the Legendary Edition of the Shepard trilogy. But that is all I had today. Please feel free to share all of your thoughts in the comments down below when it comes to open world games and how you feel about them. Do you enjoy them? Are you rather a bit of a critic like myself? I would love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments down below. Please leave a like if you have enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this one, and I'll see you in the next one. And until then, remember to keep it insightful.